I'd like to move on to the next talk, which will be the last one for today. Actually, we touched on cyber, and I think our next speakers will be very happy to hear that there was some discussion on cyber just now. So we've got representatives and gentlemen from Cover that are on next. We've got Avi and Marco. Avi is the CTO of Cover and leads all the engineering and research efforts. And Marco is head of pricing models and development at Cover. Their session will be on cyber catastrophes explained, working towards definition for the insurance industry. So over to you.
Thank you. Marco, please.
Good morning.
I'll start with presenting myself. Yeah, please.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. And let's have present, introduce himself, and then I will introduce myself.
So I'm Avi BASHAN. I'm the CTO of Cover. I have 15 years of experience in the cybersecurity industry, from working in the IDF to other companies in the market, including Checkpoint, before founding Cover 3 years ago. So that's me.
And my name is Marco GIUDICE. I have also been in the market for 15 years, but in my case, it's been mainly insurance and reinsurance, always in catastrophe modeling and pricing related roles. My last role was with Tokyo Millennium Re as head of pricing in the UK. So we recently published a paper about what we see, our definition of a cyber catastrophe. So we want to present the conclusions from that paper and maybe give you some insights about our methodology, presenting a little bit about what we do. So this is the detailed agenda which we will go over. So who is Cover? We are a cyber modeling firm. We are a vendor model for those of you who are used to this terminology. We present a number of solutions from underwriting all the way to exposure management, and we help insurers and reinsurers managing the risk. And in this specific case, relative to the stock, understanding their accumulations. So what is the problem at hand? We were presented with the challenge at the very beginning in developing our model of defining what a catastrophe is. Now, from a point of view of the insurance industry, and this is a reinsurance specific question. When you define a reinsurance contract, the very first thing that you think about is the definition of an event. We are very familiar, I'm sure you are all very familiar with the definition of, usually applied by actuaries. It's a low frequency event, high severity, and usually you've got some, information about what, a large population of affected exposures, which sometimes, gets reflected in, a trigger, a threshold of loss. There is a lengthy description there, but bringing it back to cyber, for instance, the example that probably many people have in mind is NotPetya. NotPetya happened a few years ago, and it was an event that spread across the world, but most notably affected, Maersk, the shipping company, which was in the news. And also it's in the news quite prominently that another company is now in court debating whether it was covered at all, because there was a attribution given to the Russians, and so it might be considered an act of war, and the courts are going to now decide whether attribution is enough to consider it an act of war. So all these problems are on the table. And the other major issue that we have is that when we look at the problem from a cybersecurity perspective, the conclusions we get to are different from the conclusions we get to when we look at it from a cyber insurance perspective. For instance, when you look at it from a cybersecurity perspective, what you really care about is classifying the attacks. And so you don't really mind whether they last a few days or if they last for years. From a cyber insurance perspective, an event that lasts for years, it's a little bit of it's a bit of a challenge, if you want. It's a lot easier when you have an event that is confined in time, days or months at most. The other issue that you have, when you're looking from a point of view of insurance, as we said in the previous slide, you want to have some idea of the loss, and generally, you want to consider a catastrophe something that generates a certain amount of loss. PCS, for instance, triggers at $250 million US. But from a point of view of cybersecurity, the loss is not necessarily the most important thing. Is the impact that can be, anything. It can be just spying, for instance. One thing that, however, both insurance and cybersecurity agree on is that the attributions, really being able to actually identify who did it, it's maybe not that important. And cyber insurance is getting there slowly, maybe with this, with these court cases now being debated. So how did we do it? We decided to look at the problem in the traditional way, and so divided the possible range of things that can happen in cyber into three main categories: the attritional piece, the large piece, and the catastrophe piece. That allowed us to start narrowing down what kind of events we are looking at. If you're looking at the attritional piece, those are the things that can happen every day. It can be, your social engineering, your phishing email. It can be also, your employee leaving an atom on a train. If you look at the large loss, well, we've got a few examples in mind, probably. The two that I chose are the Sony. There was a film that was stolen from Sony. It was clearly a targeted attack. And Saudi Aramco, that was a targeted attack on an oil refinery that in the end caused an explosion. Again, targeted attack, planned and studied in details before the execution. On the other hand, catastrophes have happened in the past mainly through automatic and viral attacks, stuff that went viral across the world. And the examples of the three companies there are from the NotPetya attack, which I used before as an example. But of course, NotPetya is not the only one. And now I'll pass to Avi to speak a little bit more into detail. Oh, no, sorry, I've got another slide, you see. So in order to describe the events, in our methodology, what we describe is the impact, and mainly because if it allows us to go from the incident to the insurance coverage. The incident is the actual mechanism of the attack. And that can be malware, can be ransomware, can be phishing, can be a number of things that can happen. And also, it can be a new way of infiltrating that we haven't seen yet. But the impact is always going to be a little bit easier to describe if you want. It's something to do with data, it's theft, it's manipulation. It could be a denial of service. And that in itself reflects a lot easier into insurance coverages. If it's a data theft, for instance, then you can start making, modeling how much data, what type of data, and therefore also the ancillary costs related to this with, privacy, liability, and all this sort of costs related to those. And now I'll pass it over to Avi to describe the past events.
Thank you, Marco. So in order to start developing our methodology and understanding what caused a cyber catastrophe, we went into the past. We started analyzing past cyber incidents and trying to understand how many of them had a significant economic loss across a lot of different companies. So we're not talking only about the single instances where one company was affected, where we consider a large loss, but in events where a company might seriously be affected, but with other companies as well. And when analyzing those events, we understood that there were around a few dozens of past events that we can consider a catastrophe. Another thing that is important to mention is that when we did this analysis, when going back to the past, doesn't have a lot of these events didn't have a serious insured outcome, because cyber insurance back then was not the market penetration of this product was that wide. And as we see that events go to our current days, we see the insurance outcome, insured loss, starting to be more significant. So this analysis was based on economic loss. And when doing this analysis, we understood there are two factors that can cause a catastrophic event. The first one is a bit more straightforward. We're talking about a service provider. If we have a lot of companies that are using a service provider, for example, cloud and AWS, Amazon Web Services, and this data center, specifically in AWS, a specific data center, is suffering from some kind of an outage, this will affect a lot of different companies. The challenge here is that not like a NatCat event, here different companies across the globe can use a specific data center. So if you're located in Singapore or the UK, doesn't mean that both of you are not using the same data center in Virginia that will suffer from an outage. And our example for an event that can happen to a service provider, it's not just an outage, but it can always be any other kind of cyber event. For example, Blackbaud is the service provider that suffered from a ransomware event. Email provider called VFNet 3 years ago suffered from an event where all hackers hacked into the service and deleted all the service emails and the backups. So it's not just outages, but every cyber attack can happen to a service provider. And once it happens, it will affect all the companies that are using that. So this is one, and this is more, I would say, the straightforward one. But the second one, which we saw a lot more prevalent in the cases that we analyzed, is the technologies. And what do I mean when I say technologies? So let's say a lot of different companies are using the same SQL Server database, and there's a vulnerability in the SQL Service database. So this vulnerability we can start to attack the different companies that are using this service. But it's not that in any case this vulnerability can cause a catastrophe event. It must have certain characteristics in order to have a large magnitude. And what are those characteristics? So this vulnerability that we discovered, that is discovered, must allow a viral campaign, meaning a remote code execution of code without any user interaction that will allow itself to run on the service and then start propagating automatically, meaning having some kind of a pandemic features in it, that it can spread automatically, attack one computer, scan other computers or any other device. It can be also IoT devices that are connected to the service, and then propagate to them as well. So we do see a pandemic nature in those events, and we call it a high virality factor. And this is something that we're seeing in all the technology-based events. So while it's not a single point of failure where you use the same service provider, it is something that we define as distributed single point of one technology, but it's spread across multiple companies. but all of them are using, all of them are vulnerable to the same attack. So now that after we understood our definition, let's take an example. In May 2019, there was a lot of news articles that said that millions of Dell laptops and computers are vulnerable to remote hijacks. So this sounds, at the beginning, as a catastrophe. Now, millions of Dell laptops can be taken over remotely. But when analyzing the vulnerability there, we understood that the attack must require a physical proximity in order to take over the computer, to hijack it. So this means that it doesn't have a high virality factor. It can't propagate automatically across the globe. So while this attack might cause damage, might cause attritional events or large loss events, it's not a catastrophe. And while in the newspapers, this might sound like a catastrophe, and really understanding the underlying details of what is happening, we can understand this can have this catastrophic effect. So now that we understand the definition, what can cause a catastrophe, let's try in the specific technology subtype of a catastrophe, understand how we can group different events into one. So let's go over the terminology that we use here and then start thinking if we can group them together, yes or no. So the first one is threat actor. What is a threat actor? It's the person or the group who is behind this attack. And the way to reveal who's behind the attack, this process is called attribution. And it can take, it's a process which is hard. It's not impossible, but it's hard. Sometimes it is impossible, but a lot of times we do understand who was behind the attack, but it takes serious efforts and it takes some time, meaning that it can take even a year or 2 years to understand who's behind an attack. So that's one element that we might group an attack with. The second one is exploit. Exploit, the technique to exploit the vulnerability that was discovered. And this is very specific. For example, if there's a vulnerability in a SQL database or Windows operating system, you will have a very specific exploit that can leverage this vulnerability to run code. And running the code is called the payload. The code that is executed using this exploit, that's what we call a payload. And we'll give an example for payloads in the next slide. And the third thing is impact. Impact is what is happening once the payload is running. What does the payload trying to do on the machine that it attacked? So we have all of these four elements that we can try to group an event. And when discussing it and breaking it down, we can see how some are more usable than others. So let's talk about two events that happened 3 years ago. The first one is NotPetya. Marco mentioned it and the second one is WannaCry. So NotPetya was a ransomware or a wiper attack. Okay, this is something that we understood later on. Wiper, it's an attack that wipes data. And this event affected multiple companies at a single point of time, or a very short time frame to be more accurate. And the exploit they used was an exploit that was discovered a few months earlier that is called Eternal Blue, and exploited some vulnerability in Windows. And what it did, the payload was a tool that encrypted and wiped. It was a malware that encrypted with no decryption key. So as a matter of fact, the outcome is wiping of data, and the impact was wiped data that affected availability of the data. The second campaign that we'll analyze is WannaCry. WannaCry, the exploit that it used was the same exploit. It's Eternal Blue, and the payload it used, it's a different payload, and that did real encryption. You could pay money and get your data back. And the result there, the impact, was that there were encrypted data, and it affected the integrity and availability of the data. One thing I didn't mention here is the threat actor. Now let's see the threat actors behind each campaign. And there's a small asterisk there because we're not 100% sure who's behind it. So for NotPetya, it's Sandworm. It's a group affiliated with Russian criminals. And the second, for WannaCry, it's the Lazarus group, which is affiliated with North Korea criminal groups. So analyzing this allows us to see that using the combination of exploit, payload, and impact is enough to distinguish between different events. And the beauty with this methodology, that we're not using the threat actor. One, we don't need to wait to get this threat actor attribution, which takes time or even impossible. And the second thing is that exploit, payload, and impact are data that is available. Any company that has this, has some kind of security software and is affected by an event, captures this information. So we can understand and analyze and start group different events together to understand that those events, as a matter of fact, group to a more bigger catastrophic event. So after understanding how we can group the events and developing this, this framework, there are a few more things that we need to take into consideration. The first one is that a catastrophe is rarely confined to a geographical space. It can be spread across the world. So this is one more thing that we need, a challenge that we have. This is a bit different from a service provider when specific data center is suffering from an event. And also it can be unbounded by time. And this is what Marco has mentioned. When in the cybersecurity industry, when we're analyzing a campaign, sometimes we can see a campaign that can go on for years. So how will we generate a catastrophic event that its time frame is years? This is another challenge that we have here that we had to address. So let's take an example to see how we can resolve these challenges. So let's talk about Conficker. Conficker is another malware campaign. It was discovered in November 2008. And Conficker infected over 9 million devices in the first 6 months. This event, by the way, leveraged an exploit, again in Windows. And it was very viral and could propagate automatically. And this is how it affected so many devices in such a short time frame. The economic damage that was caused because of Conficker is approximately $9.1 billion. And what is interesting, that in 2013, 5 years after we saw this campaign beginning, we still saw infections. And even today, analyzing today in 2020, we still see Conficker active. We still see it infecting devices. Do we see it affecting 9 million devices? No, a lot less, around tens of thousands to 100,000, but we still see it active. And this really shows that these events are going on for years. And analyzing the timeline of events can give us insight on how we need to address them. So in a catastrophic event that is derived from a viral vulnerability, we'll see at the beginning the expansion phase, where there's a very rapid growth of a lot of infections. Then it hits the peak of machines that it can infect, and then we'll start seeing the remission. We'll start seeing less devices affected. And why? Because we'll start seeing people installing more patches. The software security that is now installing software security that is more capable to address these threats. We can think about it same as COVID and the vaccine that hopefully will be introduced very soon. And we'll start seeing less computers being and machines being infected by this malware, and we'll go to this steady state where we'll start seeing the a constant level of infections that are happening over an amount in every period of time. And these events are attributed to more countries that are less have I would say a security hygiene, that are installing patches and installing security software. So as a matter of fact, we don't have here one catastrophe event that takes 10 years, but we have a certain period of time, like the first 6 months, that is the catastrophic phase of this event. And afterwards, we have this attritional or might be large loss events that can be caused by the same campaign. And another example for this is data that we took from We Love Security that covers infections of different ransomwares in the wild. And what we see that in 2020, between January and April, the leading ransomware was WannaCryptor. WannaCryptor sounds like WannaCry because it is WannaCry with a bit of a different name. It's the same campaign, and we're still seeing it active. But it's not the amount of devices that we saw at the beginning, but this constant attritional amount of devices that didn't install patches. So we had the catastrophic phase of the event, and now we're seeing the attritional phase of this event. That's the day-to-day ransomware events. So how do we model? How do we address this? What do we do to cover? So what we have is we have our data collection engines that allows us to generate the events, the synthetic events that we can understand how they're going to evolve and unfold. So in order to generate them, we need to collect data, severity data and frequency data. On the one hand, we're doing asset mapping on the companies, understanding what technologies they are using, what is their security posture, what is their patching cadence, they're installing patches. All of that is very, very relevant to understand what kind of events they're going to suffer. And then we're using a multi-model approach with all of this data in order to understand and fully model a portfolio and how its different events can affect it. We have the attritional loss, we have a large loss model, and we also have the catastrophic model. And we combine the result of these models to gain the full view of risk. And this can be leveraged for underwriting and exposure management. Marco, back to you. We can't hear you, you're on mute.
Yeah, apologies, I was muted myself. We have shown you our methodology very briefly, and we have discussed a definition of catastrophe. Definition of catastrophe, which includes an element of definition of an event, which we might link it to the previous slide and say that these, going down to the very basics and trying to focus on a disruption in either a service provider or a technology may well enable the development of parametric triggers. And in this particular case, we are mainly talking about reinsurance applications, whereas the previous presentation, of course, was focusing on insurance. But what is clear is that the industry is moving, is developing still, and there is room for a definition of catastrophic event to be firm and and developed further. And this is our contribution towards it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marco and Avi. Thanks for that. Very interesting talk about cyber and the catastrophe concepts within that. I actually had a question. I was going to ask a question that was asked at the previous session and maybe get your take on it, which is in terms of cyber, and maybe at a broader than the specific kind of content of your presentation, but from a cyber overall perspective, what kind of, if insurers were to design certain parametric products around around this risk, which covers various different areas and complex aspects. What kind of triggers would they use? Would they need to think through? So covering data breach, third party, so reputational risk, third party liability, response costs, etc., etc.
Yeah, maybe I'll try to give it a go. So this is mainly about insurance, of course. So the definition of event in this case is less important. What is important is what actually happens. There was before getting to the trigger, actually, there was a question before about coverages. Oh, cyber covers a number of payments. There is the cost for the recovery, the cost of maybe a liability component. How do you account for all those parts? Well, the reality is that you don't, because in a parametric trigger, you give one simple payment. It's a lump sum that is supposed to cover the cost of that particular event. And this might therefore lead us to the discussion about what kind of trigger. If we are, for instance, thinking about a data breach, we might look at the volume of data that was stolen. If it's a particular company, we know the type of data already, so we can have a better idea of what type of liability might arise from that. But it is important to remember, however, and I'll pass it on to Avi for for elaborating further, but it is important to remember that a parametric trigger in cyber can only, insurance in particular, can only cover a specific type of scenario. You end up covering yourself for something, and on the other end, not being able to cover yourself for something else. The traditional insurance in this case covers all coverages that you can have. But Avi, please elaborate further if you will.
Thank you, Marco. So I think it's connected to the impact. Is I think one of the challenges of a cyber event that there are a lot of different ways, a lot of different triggers that can cause the same thing. And this is there are endless ways, and they're also always evolving. We're seeing new attacks that are introduced. And the way we're looking at this, when trying to define any kind of event, is understanding what is the, I would say, mechanics of the event, not specifically the vulnerability itself or the specific attack methodology, and then understanding what is the impact. And this allows us to give and have something which is more of a framework that can last for a long period of time. Just an example, we do see events starting to repeat themselves. So I gave the example about NotPetya and WannaCry, but an interesting thing is that the way that they're affected Windows in a very viral way. We'll go back 9 years before 2018, Conficker used not the same exploit, but the same technique to do that. And also Stuxnet that use the same techniques as Conficker. So using that, we can start defining, I would say we need to define this framework. So it will this triggering framework and impact framework, so we can have a definition that can last and can be can contain different kinds of underlying technology events. Marco, anything you want to add there?
No, that's. I think we answered the question.
That's interesting. Thanks. Yeah, no, thanks, guys. There's a couple of questions coming in from the audience that I'll ask. So somebody's asked, what would be a simple model that that people can start out with for pricing cyber products? What are some of the important factors that need to be considered?
Wow, simple model for pricing in 30 seconds. That's a challenge for you. So the way we look at it is, we are a vendor model company. So apologies for being, for essentially selling our methodology, but that's what we do. So we look at the exposure since. I'm not sure I understand. Sorry, my phone. We look at the exposures in buckets. So we are looking at, we have a concept that we call CRA zone, which is essentially provided by 3 data points. The location, the country, the industry, and the size of the company. By looking at your exposures, by classifying companies, your cedants, in your insureds in these buckets, you are already getting closer to understanding the hazard. So that gives you an initial idea about what your rating bands are going to be in very simple terms. The frequency and the severity of losses has a bearing. So the CRA zone has a bearing on those parameters. I mean, those are the very basic rating factors. I mean, obviously everybody is using Windows, but more specialized industries like energy, for instance, use specialized software, and that also has something, that also is a factor that you need to take into account. So even without knowing every single information about your cedant, just by knowing these 3 data points, you can start making considerations about frequency and severity. That's my 30-second pitch.
And if I
that's
can add,
really useful. Yeah.
Yeah. Apologies.
Sorry, please carry on.
So we have this framework in our website. It's free. This is for the industry, so everybody can go ahead, download this framework, and go over the explanation, and load their portfolio into it, and see the exposure using this methodology. So it's out there. Please use it. We released it a few months ago, and we're getting feedback from the industry about it, and we're very excited and happy, to contribute to the effort by the whole industry for this regard.
Thanks, Faz. Another question, probably related a little bit to what you've answered as well, but the question is, for a lot of cyber insurers, the common challenge includes evaluating frequency of losses and accumulation risk. What is your take on these 2 challenges?
Right, I'll break it down into 2. When you look at the frequency of losses, we have this framework where we're looking at losses in 3 buckets, right? In attritional, large, and cat. And I think it is important to keep the 3 pieces separate. We all talk about cyber as being a very dynamic risk that changes over time. The reality is that when it comes to the big accumulation losses, not a lot changes very quickly. It evolves over time, but it's more of an organic evolution. If you think about it, if you think about it, in our view of the world, the large losses are driven by technology and service providers, and those are aspects of a business that don't change very frequently. Even if you have a highly disrupting technology that comes into the market, the take-up rate is gradual. It doesn't change overnight. So the landscape of the threat changes gradually. But when it comes to attritional losses, on the other hand, the dynamic aspect of the peril actually comes into play, and you have a situation where you need to dynamically look at what happens to your loss ratio, in essence. So that's why we keep them separate, and that's how we look at it.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Okay.
Avi, do you want to add anything? I think it's fine.
Great. Thanks. Oh, he may be frozen, I think, maybe.
Yeah, he might be frozen.
Oh, no. Okay. But thanks for the interesting presentation and answering questions, Marco and Avi.